South Korean President Yoon departed for New York to attend the UN General Assembly, and at the top of his agenda, addressing ramped-up North Korea-Russian military ties. Having wrapped up a 6-day trip to Russia that involved talks with President Vladimir Putin, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un returns to Pyongyang, after which their military cooperation will likely accelerate. Korea's ancient legacy of the Gaya tumuli become a UNESCO World Heritage for their outstanding value in showing the diversity of ancient civilizations in East Asia. It's September 18th, 2023. This is News Center. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We start with renewed flurry of diplomacy. South Korean President Yoon departed for New York today for the UN General Assembly for a second year in a row. On his mind are addressing ramped-up military ties between North Korea and Russia, while assuring world leaders that South Korea's Busan is ready for the 2030 World Expo. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young has more.
President Yoon Suk-yeol reissued this warning against North Korea and Russia's potential arms cooperation, saying the international community will unite even more tightly against the move. The South Korean leader's remarks were published in an interview with the Associated Press ahead of his visit to New York to attend the United Nations General Assembly. Yoon said that military cooperation between Pyongyang and the Kremlin is illegal and unjust, as it contravenes UN Security Council resolutions and various global sanctions. This came amid concerns that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin last week could lead to a weapons deal between the two sides. The Kim-Putin meeting notably came on the heels of the trilateral Camp David summit between South Korea, the United States and Japan in August. Pointing to Seoul and Washington's pledges this year to expand joint military drills and plan joint responses to nuclear contingencies, Yoon said that the two sides had reaffirmed that any nuclear attack by North Korea will be met with a swift, overwhelming and decisive response that would end the regime. Echoing his words at the East Asia Summit earlier this month, Yoon again stressed that China should play a responsible and constructive role in handling North Korea, as well as addressing other global challenges. He is expected to make a similar call during a speech at the UN General Assembly on Wednesday local time. Yoon said that as South Korea, as a non-permanent member of the Security Council next year, will play a responsible role on pertinent issues, including North Korea's nuclear program and the war in Ukraine. He will also address global gaps in the areas of development, climate response and digital transformation, and lay out South Korea's plan to help resolve such challenges, particularly in tackling the growing digital divide and building new global norms to make digital technology ethical and beneficial for humanity. Yoon will hold a Digital Vision Forum at New York University, expanding on the principles he declared in Paris back in June. Until his fifth and final day in New York City, the South Korean leader will hold at least 30 bilateral meetings on the sidelines in an all-out effort to win support for Busan City's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
Having wrapped up a 6-day trip to Russia that involved talks with Putin, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is reportedly heading home. Works between North Korea and Russia are likely to accelerate for cooperation on weapons and spy satellites. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji explains.
North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has headed home after wrapping up his 6-day-long trip to Russia. The North State media said on Monday that Kim successfully completed his trip and left Vladivostok on Sunday. It added that the visit will open up a, quote, new chapter in their bilateral relations. Amid signs of the two isolated countries strengthening military cooperation, the international community has voiced criticism that any arms deal between North Korea and Russia would be a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Regarding the matter, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Moscow wants to develop, quote, equal and fair cooperation with North Korea, despite sanctions imposed on the regime by the UN Security Council. During an interview with Russia's state media on Sunday local time, he said it was the UN Security Council that imposed sanctions on North Korea, not Russia. This comes after the Kremlin earlier said it abides by UN sanctions, but that it has a right to develop relations with its neighbors, including in relation to sensitive topics. Kim Jong-un's trip to Russia was his longest foreign trip since he took power in 2011. He arrived in Russia last Tuesday and had a 5-hour meeting with Putin the next day. He then went on a tour of Russia's Far East, visiting key military facilities and inspecting weapons like nuclear-capable strategic bombers, hypersonic missiles, and warplanes before leaving on Sunday. An expert told Arirang News that Kim would want to gain technology to make leaps and bounds for not only his spy satellite program, but also for missiles.
But he would likely want more military technology from Russia to continue to augment and refine North Korea's capabilities. And his visit was really a buffet line of military-related facilities in Russia that he may want to gain technology from.
In the past 4 months, North Korea failed to launch a spy satellite twice and has earlier said that it will make a third attempt in October. South Korean and U.S. officials have been concerned about North Korea supplying artillery and weapons to Russia in exchange for satellite launch technology. Hangzhou, Arirang News.
North Korea has started to send its athletes to China to take part in the Hangzhou Asian Games set to kick off this Saturday. 20 more North Korean athletes reportedly traveled to the city after around 60 had arrived there last Friday. Sources say the group left the north border city of Siniju by bus and arrived in China's Dandong, located just over the border. From there, they most likely boarded a flight to Hangzhou. North Korea has registered a total of 191 athletes to attend this year's Asian Games, so the regime will likely use the same route to send the rest of them to Hangzhou. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has met Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi for closed-door consultations. Amid tense talks over Taiwan, the two countries say their talks were candid. Now eyes are on a possible Washington-Beijing summit in the weeks to come. Choi Min-jung reports.
Top officials from the United States and China held candid talks over the weekend ahead of a potential meeting between their leaders later this year. Washington and Beijing separately announced on Sunday that U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi held candid, substantive, and constructive talks during multiple meetings over the course of the 2 days. The talks were held on the Mediterranean island nation of Malta. The two sides reportedly discussed key issues in bilateral relations between the U.S. and China, global and regional security matters, and Russia's war against Ukraine. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said that both parties agreed to maintain high-level exchanges and hold bilateral consultations on Asia-Pacific affairs, maritime affairs, and foreign policy. However, the two did not appear to reach a consensus on issues surrounding Taiwan. Wang reportedly stressed that Taiwan remains the #1 red line that must not be crossed in Washington-Beijing relations. The official added the U.S. should honor its commitment to not support Taiwan's independence. Sullivan, on the other hand, called for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait during his meeting with Wang. Meanwhile, the White House suggested that more meetings between the U.S. and China are to come through maintaining the strategic channel of communication and pursuing additional high-level engagement in key areas in the coming months. This comes as U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping are anticipated to hold talks on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Summit taking place in San Francisco in November. More high-level talks are also expected before the year end.
Whether it's at UNGA or whether it is after UNGA, sometime before the end of the year, it is still our expectation that Secretary Blinken will host Foreign Minister Wang Yi here in the United States.
Meanwhile, Wang on Monday began a 4-day trip to Russia, where he is expected to lay the groundwork for President Vladimir Putin's possible landmark visit to Beijing in October. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
A collection of ancient tombs here in Korea have been given a UNESCO World Heritage status for their outstanding value in showing the diversity of ancient civilizations in East Asia. Shin Se-byuk has more.
The Gaya Tumuli, a cluster of 7 tombs from Korea's ancient Gaya Confederacy, was inscribed on UNESCO's World Heritage Site list on Sunday. The decision was made during the 45th session of the World Heritage Committee held in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Gaya was a confederation that prospered between the 1st and 6th centuries in the southern and central regions of the Korean peninsula. The inscription comes after a decade-long effort which began when the burial mounds were put on a tentative list in 2013. In May this year, the tumuli were recommended for inclusion on the UNESCO World Heritage List by the International Council on Monuments and Sites, an advisory organization under UNESCO. The Cultural Heritage Administration said the latest edition recognizes the tumuli's outstanding universal value.
The Gaya Tumuli show the diversity of ancient civilizations in East Asia. They serve as evidence that neighboring countries could maintain horizontal relationships while maintaining autonomy.
The cone-shaped burial mounds, which extend across the hills of Goryeo in Gyeongsangnam Province, include burial accessories and items showing the Confederation's network of trade as well as shared cultural commonalities. With the latest inscription, Korea now has 16 sites on the UNESCO World Heritage List. The Cultural Heritage Administration plans to pursue a UNESCO World Heritage listing for landmarks such as the capital fortification of Hanyang in Seoul. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
The Korean authorities speed up its goal of building a global high-tech industrial cluster by injecting funds worth $1.7 billion over the next 5 years, while easing regulations on investment for venture firms. An Sung-jin has more.
Amid efforts to boost industrial competitiveness, the South Korean government reiterated measures to nurture a high-tech industry global cluster. At an emergency meeting held at the Seoul government complex on Monday, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho and affiliated ministers announced plans to follow up those made at a meeting with President Yoon Suk-yeol in June to accelerate efforts to make South Korea an industrial powerhouse. The meeting centered around boosting investment and easing regulations. The government plans to invest a total of $1.7 billion until 2028 in industrial clusters for high-tech and biotech industries, research and development infrastructure, and support for startups. We'll start off by investing around $300 million in 2024. It also revamped rules for the private investment venture ecosystem by raising the external investment limit on capital invested by general holding companies from 40% to 50%. The finance minister is aiming to strengthen other regulations as well.
We'll promptly amend related laws within this year to allow business support service companies in law, accounting, and venture capital fields to move into industrial facility area clusters.
However, limitations remain as far as becoming a world-leading industrial cluster is concerned, due to regulations on business sectors that can move in, venture capital investment based on policy funds, and a lack of technological commercialization. The government aims to promote tax exemptions for public institutions and establish detailed plans for special clusters. With the aim of establishing South Korea as a stable manufacturing and export center by emphasizing the role of industrial clusters amid intensified competition over technology hegemony, the government will continue to accelerate its effort. An Sung-jin, Arirang News.
The Finance Ministry's tax revenue projection for 2023 is around 14.8% short of its initial forecast. According to the latest revision by the ministry on Monday, tax revenue is expected to decrease by 59 trillion won from the previous outlook made earlier this year, which is around $44 billion. That is the largest shortage ever, resulting to an estimated total tax income of about 341 trillion won, or approximately $257 billion. The ministry says this is mainly attributed to sluggish exports of Korean companies, especially in the semiconductor industries, due to this global economic slowdown. Today, 4.04 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine targeting COVID-19 XBB.1.5 variant arrive in Korea. Korea Disease Control and Prevention Agency says that the vaccine, which targets a specific subvariant of Omicron, will be used as the seasonal COVID vaccination. Pfizer's vaccine was approved by the European Medicines Agency in late August and has received emergency use authorization in Korea. 10 million doses will be gradually introduced, including today's shipment. Specific COVID-19 vaccination plans will be announced next week, with the priority being given to individuals aged over 65 and older. Prosecutors have requested an arrest warrant again for the nation's main opposition Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung. He faces corruption allegations, among others. Lee was taken to hospital earlier in the morning due to his deteriorating health from a prolonged hunger strike. Our Kim Jong-sil reports.
Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung's limit came on the 19th day of his hunger strike, something he began almost 3 weeks ago to protest the Yoon administration. At 7:10 on Monday morning, Lee was taken to a hospital near to the National Assembly in a condition that his closest allies described as confused due to weeks of not eating. Lee's condition improved as of Monday afternoon, but he is determined to continue with the strike under medical surveillance. Not long after, the Seoul Central Prosecutor's Office requested an arrest warrant for the DP leader on corruption allegations.
While DP leader Lee Jae-myung was taken to hospital, the prosecution requested an arrest warrant. Even the past military regimes didn't show such outrageous behavior in front of the public.
Lee faces 2 allegations. The first is that he gave special favors to a private developer in Seongnam's Baekhyundong district apartment project between 2014 and 2015 when he served as the city's mayor. The prosecution says this cost the city around 20 billion Korean won, or about $15 million. The second is with regard to South Korean underwear company Sangbangul Group wiring $8 million to North Korea, which prosecutors say Lee either knew or approved of this transaction. They add that some of the money was to facilitate Lee's planned visit to Pyongyang, viewing this as third-party bribery. The DP leader has consistently denied all allegations, saying prosecutors investigated him for 2 years but were unable to come up with any evidence. The ruling People Power Party, on the other hand, welcomed the prosecution's move.
DP leader Lee Jae-myung tried to buy time somehow, but he couldn't avoid the strict legal process. We respect the prosecution that complied with the principle there are no exceptions before the law.
Given that Lee is a lawmaker, a consent for arrest must be put to a vote at the National Assembly. Democratic Party members said they haven't yet decided what to do about the possible vote that could take place as early as this Thursday. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
The Korean Railway Workers Union ended its 4-day general strike Monday morning, but warned of a second one if their requests aren't met in the coming days. The strikers have called for better working conditions and an expansion of state-operated trains, opposing what they call the ongoing steps towards railway privatization. The Transport Ministry and the Korea Railroad Corporation refused to discuss the requests, calling the strike unjustified, saying they are not pushing for privatization. The second strike would continue for an indefinite period of time, although the union hasn't specified when it would begin. For the time being, train operations are returning to normal in stages, with full operation expected by 9 in the evening. Time now to take a look at what's been happening in the world of sports. Joining us in the studio is our sports editor, Paul Neat. Evening, Paul.
Hello there.
The Asian Games is just around the corner, and one of South Korea's well-known athletes, stars, seem to be in good form. High jumper Woo Sung-hyuk with the Diamond League title.
Yes, and in doing so, he's become the first South Korean to win in this top-tier athletics event. And as well as the title, Woo Sang-hyuk on Saturday in Oregon matched his own national record height of 2.35 meters, earning him $30,000 in prize money in the process. Haywood Field is a familiar venue for Woo, as it's where he won silver at the World Athletics Championship last year. Woo made it to the final by finishing in the top 6 in the Diamond League points, earning 4th spot. Norbert Kobiewski of Poland came second after clearing 2.33 meters. Juvon Harrison of the United States, who finished third, also cleared 2.33 meters, but needed 2 more attempts than his Polish counterpart Kobielski.
And the Asian Games get underway officially on Saturday with the opening ceremony, but football tournament actually begins earlier. South Korea's men and women's teams are in action this week.
Yes, that's right. Tomorrow, in fact, for the men's team. They face Kuwait to get their Group E campaign up and running. South Korea's men's team won gold in 2018 in Indonesia and in 2014 on home soil, and so will be looking for a 3rd straight gold. The team will be without Lee Gang-in, though, for the first game. The attacking midfielder will make his return from injury in Paris Saint-Germain's European Champions League match with Borussia Dortmund on Tuesday, local time. Then he will join up with the Korea squad at the Asian Games. After the game tomorrow against Kuwait, it's Thailand on Thursday and then Bahrain on Sunday. For the women's team, their first game is against Myanmar on Friday, then the Philippines next Monday and Hong Kong next Thursday. There are some other sports getting underway this week too. Beach volleyball, indoor volleyball and cricket all begin tomorrow as well.
And let's talk more about football. The K-League has hit a new attendance record. What's that?
Yes, right. Well, 1.83 million fans in 176 games so far this season is a new record. This beats the previous record of 1.82 million in 228 matches in 2019. Now, this is based on counting the number of paid spectators, not freebies or press, something that K-League shifted to in 2018. And the record will only get bigger as well, as there are still 50 matches to go, and the business end of the season is just around the corner with a close race for the top 6 and a tightly contested relegation battle, meaning 2 million fans is well within reach. The average attendance per match has been at around 10,400. By club, FC Seoul have had the highest average attendance so far at 21,830, followed by Ulsan Hyundai at just over 17,500, and then Daesun Hana Citizen with around 13,000.
And finally to golf. South Korean Kim Sung-yeon has finished runner-up at PGA Tour fall event.
Yes, that's right, and that's his best performance on the PGA Tour as well. But not only that, it's only the 25-year-old's second top 10 finish at the Fortinet Championship in Napa, California on Sunday local time. Kim shot a 19 under 269, finishing just 2 strokes behind the winner, Sahith Theegala of the US. The FedEx Cup fall consists of 7 events, and only those who ranked outside the top 50 in terms of their FedEx Cup points can collect points in these fall events. Those inside the top 125 points earn a PGA Tour card for next year, and so a lot is at stake. Meanwhile, veteran golfer Chae Kyung-ju on Sunday in South Dakota finished runner-up at the PGA Sanford International. 15 under 195 was enough to finish just 1 stroke behind the winner, Steve Stricker.
Great. Thanks for that, Paul. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. See you.
Similar weather conditions are in store for tomorrow with unseasonable heat prevailing. Under partly cloudy skies, daytime highs will exceed the seasonal average at 27 degrees Celsius in Seoul. For parts of the south, a high-pressure system will be more dominant, which will lead to much warmer spells. For places like Yangsan in Gyeongsangnam-do province, conditions will be close to sweltering at 31 degrees. With the heat, the sun's UV radiation will be strong nationwide. And brief showers are expected for parts of Gyeonggi-do province for the afternoon hours. The amount of rainfall won't be too much, with about 5 millimeters. By Wednesday, a widespread low-pressure system will enter the country, producing nationwide rain. At times, local downpours are expected, so make sure to plan accordingly. Morning temperatures will be 1 to 2 degrees higher than today. Seoul and Gwangju will be starting off at 21 degrees. Highs in Seoul will get up to 27, Daejeon 28, Daegu, Gyeongju, and Busan will all be topping out at 29 degrees. After the rain, morning temperatures will fall below the 20-degree mark on Thursday. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is News Center for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session coming up.
If you want to capture life's moments with friends, if you want to witness your parents' joyful moments, if you want to gift special memories to your child, if you truly wish, come to the garden. Before autumn fades away, come to Suncheon. Suncheonman International Garden Expo.
The taste of Namdo, bridging the world. Unfolding in the romantic city of Yosu, Jeonnam. The 29th Namdo Food Festival is going to be held from October 6th to October 8th. A place where flavors transform into art and tastes become cherished memories. Relish the autumnal charm of Namdo, which nourishes both the soul and the senses in the vibrant city of Yosu, synonymous with romance and vitality. Feel and taste the origin of K-food to the distinguished 29th Namdo Food Festival. We warmly invite you all.
Arirang TV is conducting a quality and satisfaction evaluation to enhance the broadcast service for viewers worldwide. Please visit our website www.arirang.com to provide your honest opinions. Participants will be entered into a draw for a chance to win prizes. 2023 Overseas TV Viewer Survey. We look forward to hearing from you.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Federico Cuello. I am the ambassador of the Dominican Republic in the Republic of Korea. Arirang is the one channel in which ambassadors have a say. Ambassadors' opinions are taken into consideration. Ambassadors can promote what they are doing. I am truly grateful to be asked to speak for Arirang. I hope Arirang continues and Diplomat Talks continues as well, because really it is the one window in my 6 postings as ambassador I have found to speak about my work and to speak about those issues that are of relevance for the Dominican Republic and for Korea. And I look forward to coming back as many times as possible during the remaining time I have here in Korea, resonating with the world with Arirang.
I heard that Korea's MZ generation flocked to this market, ready to awaken your shopping senses.
Lose it or spend it.
Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Today, President Yoon Suk-yeol embarked on a 5-day visit to New York to attend the UN General Assembly. During a general debate, leaders of the world are expected to deliver speeches, and President Yoon is not an exception. He will express concerns over strengthening ties between North Korea and Russia and deliver Seoul's plan to enhance its contribution in the global arena as befits South Korea's growing international status. The trip to New York is expected to be a very busy one, with President Yoon also holding at least 30 bilateral summits on the sidelines of the Assembly. What will be the highlights of the high-level week of the 78th UN General Assembly, and what can we expect from President Yoon's speech there? For more on this, we have invited Professor Robert Kelly from Busan National University. Welcome, Professor Kelly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi. And we also have Professor Kim Jae-chun, who is the Dean of Seogang Graduate School of International Studies as well. Now, good to see you, Professor Kim. All right, Professor Kim, first question to you. A week of high-level discussion at the 78th session of the UN General Assembly begins today, with the highlight a general debate taking place the next day. Now, historically, what role have General Assembly sessions played?
Well, the United Nations is still the most important international organization in the world, and the UN General Assembly is the most representative organ of the United Nations. So the role of UNGA, General Assembly, is to discuss and debate, and if possible, to make recommendations on some of the most pressing international issues. The issue can be security issues, such as the arms deal between North Korea and Russia. It can be developmental issue. Usually, the debate that is taking place there attracts significant attention, significant international attention. So during the debate, member states leaders, they'll have the opportunities to express their views on major international issues. So this year, I think there's going to be a heated debate on this illicit arms deal between North Korea and Russia and its illegality.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, U.S. President Joe Biden is going to deliver a speech on Tuesday during the high-level general debate as well. What is he expected to include in his speech?
Yeah, I would imagine that a lot of it is going to be, as was just mentioned, a lot of it's going to be about the Russian-North Korea, the Russian-North Korea deal. I think that's really going to sort of take over actually a lot of Yoon's trip, because it really does look like the Russians and the North Koreans are moving together in a pretty serious way. And Kim, this was his longest trip, right? I think since 2011, I believe the longest ever of his tenure. I mean, it looks like they're making a really big effort to sort of double down, and so I think, at least for the Koreans, I think that this is going to be like the big story, right? I mean, how do we sort of block, how do we prevent this from becoming like a real sort of axis of authoritarianism or something along those lines? And then beyond that, I think, you know, Biden may go off and talk about climate change and things like that, but I think the core of it is going to be the North Korea Russia stuff that we've been discussing here.
Right. Now, not just Biden, Professor Kim, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is expected to show up in person at the U.S. annual gathering of world leaders as well. And he is also going to go to Washington, D.C. to talk with President Joe Biden. What does his visit to the U.S. mean this time around?
President Zelensky has been very busy on the world stage, and the objective is to elicit support for Ukraine, you know, moral support as well as physical support, you know, material support. I don't think North Korea's military support for Russia is going to be a game changer there, but still Russia will be in a better position to hold on to their line of defense. It is expected that Ukraine will launch a second counter offensive, but with ammos from North Korea, Russians can defend themselves better. If that is the case, the war will drag on indefinitely. The war has already morphed into a war of attrition. And, you know, Ukraine is a smaller country than is Russia, so the longer the war drags on, the more difficult it could get for Ukrainians. Sure, there is flagging support from the West, but from the perspective of Ukrainians and from the perspective of Zelensky, it is really important to mobilize continuous and unrelenting support from the international community, and most importantly, from the United States.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, as we have keep talking about this, the key of the heated debate will be Kim-Putin summit that has recently taken place. And the U.S., as Blinken said, is looking to make sure it can impose costs and consequences. Could any noteworthy effective measures against North Korea and Russia's potential violations of the UNSC resolutions be discussed?
Yeah, I think that's actually going to be one of the big things that's going to be discussed by both the Americans and the Koreans, right? Again, it's sort of as our discussion is headed here, I think this is going to be a big element of both the Yoon and the Biden speech. The sanctions on North Korea have been voted on repeatedly at the UN level, I believe 9 times, and they were all unanimous. I mean, this is something that's pretty core. If you want the UN Security Council to be an international lawmaking body, then enforcing sanctions on North Korea is actually pretty important, because there's been so much attention on it. And the Russians are now moving towards an open violation of that. I mean, this is a pretty major challenge, I would argue. I understand, I mean, North Korea is sort of a small country and lots of other issues out there in the world, but I mean, this is actually a pretty major violation. Russia is a permanent veto holding power on the Security Council. It's one of the P5. It's, you know, at least until the last year or so with the war, it's been considered a great power in international politics, and it's now behaving in a way that's really, really irresponsible, right? I mean, it's just flying right in the face of international law. The Russians have been sort of cheating on the sanctions and looking the other way for a while. But I mean, this is sort of like open, blatant violation. And I really wonder what the Americans and you know, other U.S. partners, South Korea, Japan, the Europeans are going to do, because this is so obvious, right? We expect this kind of behavior from the North Koreans, but not really from the Russians. I have the feeling that, you know, if Putin goes through with this, I mean, the sanctions on Russia, which are part of the Ukraine war, will probably tighten at some point. I wonder if we're going to kick the Russians out of the SWIFT system. I mean, that would be a huge step. I'm not sure how much more we can sanction North Korea, right? I mean, we all know the real issue, I think, with North Korean sanctions is enforcement rather than sort of layering on more punishment. I think the real issue is, how do you punish Russia? How do you punish a country that is as large as Russia? It's still a really big economy. A lot of countries have lent money to it, right? We're not fully comfortable expelling it from the banking system, right? We do think that there's got to be some way to reintegrate Russia in the future. We don't want a power with that many nuclear weapons being excluded from world politics forever. That's really, really risky. And so I think that's really where the rubber meets the road. I think that's going to be the real trick for Biden and U.S. allies generally, is how do we punish the Russians in such a way that's not so extreme that it provokes some kind of massive backlash. But on the other hand, we've got to get the Russians staying behind the sanctions, right? If you want the UN to be meaningful, then, you got to stand behind the sanctions for which we have voted. And that's the real trick. I'm just not sure how the Americans are going to thread that needle.
Right, I see. So the whole point will be on how the Russia could be punished by the global society. Now, Professor Kim, I'd like to ask you about North Korea and Russia's stance at the meeting. Who from each country is expected to deliver speeches, and what might they say?
I don't know. I honestly don't know who to speak for Russia and North Korea. I know that Vladimir Putin is not coming. Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov, that's his name, right? He is meeting with China today. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi today. So I don't think Lavrov is coming either. In case of North Korea, maybe their ambassador to the United Nations may speak, but it's still up in the air. Transparency is lacking in these totalitarian countries. What would they speak? Speakers from both countries, no matter who they will be, they will try to defend their position, their recent moves, saying that their cooperation is not in violation of the UN Security Council resolution. Their cooperation will take place within the boundary of the UN Security Council resolution. And they'll probably say that they have no option but to strengthen their cooperation because the United States and South Korea and also Japan, these countries are trying to encircle them, their usual excuses.
All right, so we'll just have to wait and see who from each country delivers a speech and what they're going to say. Now, Professor Kelly, let's also tap on China. So instead of the country's most senior diplomat Wang Yi, China's Vice President Hangzhou is to attend UN General Assembly session. What does this mean, and what is China's view of the current strengthening of ties between Pyongyang and Moscow?
Right. So I think the fact that the Chinese and the Russians aren't really sending people very high up indicates how much the Russians and the Chinese actually think about the UN system, which is to say not a whole lot, right? That if it comes to sort of choosing between their national interests, fairly narrowly defined, and supporting international law, the sanctions regime on North Korea, they're going to choose their national interests, which in this case is that everybody, these three countries, North Korea, Russia, and China, all want Russia to win the Ukraine war. Right? I mean, it's pretty clear now that that's what this is. I think that's where this is evolving, right? I mean, the globe is sort of splitting along the lines of this war, and that is, I think, why you're seeing, this sort of non-participation at the UN. Right, in the long term, I think for China, right, I think the Chinese, as I was saying, I think the Chinese want the Russians to win the war in part because that sets a precedent for China should it want to move on Taiwan in the future. But I think more importantly that if China is going to have a powerful partner in Russia to sort of challenge the American-led order, right, they need the Russians to win, right? The Chinese don't want to tie themselves to a loser, right? But the Chinese are sort of wary about supporting the Russians too much because that would cut off their access to Western markets, right? But you are getting this kind of like vague sort of axis or collaboration, if you will, between China, Russia, and North Korea, possibly Iran, right? Certainly the Biden administration has emphasized that a lot. But I mean, the Chinese are in the trickiest position, right? Because the Chinese have a pretty deep economic relationship with the West, which these other powers don't. The Russians had that 2 years ago, but that's over. Russia's kind of been expelled for a while, right? But China, it's really tricky, right? If the Chinese come out and openly support North Korean nuclearization or the Russian invasion, right, that will lead to a cessation of China's market access, which they need to grow. And so I think that's why the Chinese have been so quiet on the war, right? The war is the biggest thing in international politics right now. And the Chinese are barely saying anything about it, right? And the reason they're doing it is because, they want the Ukrainians to win, or the Russians to win, but they don't want to say that to the West because they need our market access, right? So they're in this weird position and they're basically not saying anything, right? Which is bizarre, but I think that sort of illustrates how China has like one foot in each camp. It's kind of a tangle.
All right, I see your point. Now, Professor Kim, moving on to President Yoon's visit to New York. So he is expected to use his upcoming address at the General Assembly to send a message about strengthening ties between North Korea and Russia. How do you expect the message's tone to be?
But I expect President Yoon to use the strongest language possible to condemn both countries, both Russia and North Korea. The venue here is the United Nations General Assembly, and as Professor Kelly just mentioned, one of the permanent member countries of the UN Security Council is trying to violate the UN Security Council resolution that they voted for. So what better way to condemn Russia than to take advantage of this venue, UN venue here, which is UN General Assembly. President Yoon will also impart a very strong message to North Korea as well. Your aggression here will only strengthen ROK-US alliance. It will only strengthen trilateral security cooperation between South Korea, the US, and then Japan. And in addition to these messages of warning, I think President Yoon will also talk about South Korea's global pivot state diplomacy, how South Korea can contribute to the peace and also prosperity of the world.
Right, I see. We're going to talk about the details that will be included in the President Yoon's speech. But before that, Professor Kelly, the Yoon administration underscored how South Korea is considering individual measures Seoul can take on its own, along with multilateral measures it could take with key allies such as Washington and Tokyo. What could those measures be?
Yeah, when it comes to the North Koreans, I'm not sure that there's too much more that we can do, right? I mean, you can always pass more sanctions. You can always sort of try to target specific North Koreans. That's sort of something that we've been experimenting with in the last few years. But of course, North Korea's league doesn't travel much. It's hard to get to their monies, which are tucked away in Russian and Chinese banks and stuff like that. I think that the tougher issue for South Korea in the future is going to be responding to Russia, right? If the Russians really do give the North Koreans a serious technological step up on things like missiles, planes, tanks, submarines, right? If actually, we don't know yet, but if the Russians actually come through on this stuff, that can actually be a pretty serious deal for South Korean security, right? The Yoon people are trying to signal that. And there, I think the South Koreans really do have some levers, most importantly, which is that South Korea and Russia still have a trading relationship, and the South Koreans could sever that, right? This is something that previous ROK President Moon Jae-in was unwilling to do, right? Your viewers may recall that the initial South Korean response to the war was sort of like, this isn't really our business, and whatever, we still want to export cars and whatnot to the Russians. And then sort of came the sort of pressure from the rest of the world, and the South Koreans kind of backed off. And the rest of the world has slowly been delinking from Russia to punish it for its behavior. And I think the South Koreans could do that. And I think if the South Koreans did that, that would sort of get to this question of South Korean status and stuff like that. It would actually look like South Korea had sort of a values-driven diplomacy rather than being sort of mercantile. We'll just sell stuff to any despot in the world, right? And I think the Yoon people really grasp that in a way that previous ROK presidents have not. That's why the Yoon president, I think President Yoon likes to be around the Japanese and the Americans and the Europeans, because it feels like that South Korea is sort of part of this larger liberal democratic family. And right now, for the liberal democratic community in the world, the big issue is Ukraine. And I think the South Koreans are slowly coming around on that, and you're going to see that probably in the South Korean response. If the Russians give away something really serious, I think that the South Koreans are going to sort of lower the axe on the trading relationship, which a lot of other countries have done. So I'm not actually sure that it's such a big deal at this point, but I think that's probably what's going to happen.
Right, I see your point, how Russia, responding to Russia could be the biggest challenge South Korea might have to deal with. Now, Professor Kim, so let's move on to President's details that might be included. The President is expected to have how government is planning to contribute to bridging global gaps. And given that President Yoon pledged contributions for the green transition and also for Ukraine's recovery during the recent G20 meeting, it seems the Yoon administration is showing how South Korea can contribute more to global society. How do you see such efforts?
But I see them positively. I think of these efforts of South Korea very highly. South Korea, I mean, think about it. South Korea now is one of the richest countries in the world, one of the strongest countries. 70 years ago, South Korea was one of the most impoverished countries in the world, but we grew this fast due in large part to the handsome support from the international community, from other countries. So I think now it's about time for South Korea to give back. It's our moral obligation. And too long, South Korea's diplomatic vision had stayed on the Korean Peninsula affairs and on Northeast Asian affairs. I think it's time for South Korea to expand the diplomatic horizon and engage in the world proactively. That I think is what South Korea's Yoon government's global people state diplomacy is all about.
Professor Kim, do you believe such contributions could really help South Korea to become a global pivotal state?
Well, I think so. Yeah, it'll all add up. So eventually, it'll augment South Korea's soft power capital, in which case it'll come back to South Korea as more tangible benefits.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Kelly, South Korea is also going to play its role as a non-permanent member of the UNSC for 2024 to 2025, and President Yoon's speech is going to include that as well. What role could South Korea play in the global arena as a non-permanent member?
Yeah, I think actually Dr. Kim sort of put his finger on it right there, right? That South Korea can sort of do more than just be sort of this export power, right? That South Korea is now a pretty wealthy state, right? I believe the South Korean economy is sort of the 11th largest in the world. I should add in passing, by the way, it's larger than the Russian economy. So when people sort of worry in South Korea, oh, we're going to lose this trade relationship with Russia, it's actually, South Korea is actually bigger than Russia now in terms of economic product. And so I think this is sort of a time when, again, I think the Yoon people really want this. This is a time when South Korea can step forward and say, you know, look, our foreign policy is about more than just selling like refrigerators or whatever, right? That we really want to go off and make a stand about, you know, climate change or North Korea or proliferation or, you know, democracy and human rights and things like that, right? And I think the Yoon people really want to do this, and I would imagine that these are the kinds of things that are going to be emphasized. Now, particularly for the South Koreans, what that's probably got to mean is always it's got to be North Korea, right? I mean, the South Koreans are really worried about North Korean nuclear missilization, right? That's one of the reasons why we have the sanctions, is to keep the North Koreans from sort of running away with this sort of spiraling program. But, you know, as was mentioned before, again, by Dr. Kim, right, I think the South Koreans, particularly this government, wants a sort of larger vision, right? Sort of like, what role can South Korea play on other kinds of pressing issues? And there's certainly lots of them out there. You know, climate change is a big one, right? That's an obvious one. You know, human rights and refugees and stuff like that. I mean, there are all kinds of issues out there where South Korea can sort of take a stand. And but if I had to guess, for the Yoon people, I would say it's going to be sort of like values, democracy, and things like that, because the Yoon people have been hinting at that for so long, right? You know, Yoon going to NATO and talking to the Europeans and talking to Biden and having the meeting with the Japanese and all that at Camp David. All of that is sort of circled around this idea that South Korea is going to start including liberal democratic rhetoric into its foreign policy, right? It's going to be, we're going to have more than just sort of exports, it's going to be values too. And I think that's great, actually. I think it's, you know, South Korea is a pretty wealthy place and can sort of do more than just be an exporter. So it's nice to see, I think.
All right, I see your point. Now, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask this last question to our Professor Kim. So during the visit to New York, President Yoon will hold bilateral talks with leaders from at least 30 countries as well. Which meeting might be the most noteworthy to take a closer look at?
I don't know. I think every bilateral summit is important. I think, you know, they will all add up. You know, President Yoon is portraying himself as the #1 salesperson of South Korea. I think he has lived up to that nickname. I think the objective of these bilateral summits is to sort of promote South Korea's sales diplomacy, you know, economic diplomacy, if you will. And also, they are also to elicit support for Busan Expo in Busan, where Professor Kelly lives in now.
Right.
All right, I see.
Right. We need the expo. We need the expo down here, man.
All right.
You got that right, yeah.
All right. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Kim and Professor Kelly, for your insights and time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.